Well, no surprise, Piers Morgan is up to his usual journalistic malpractice again. This week on his show Uncensored, he had a few American guests on there. They were Tommy Robinson supporters, and while they were all very well-meaning, they didn't know all the details of Tommy's past legal history, so they were unable to rebut a string of Piers's misleading statements, which some might call outright lies, frankly, direct lies or lies by omission. So being that I am familiar with the political persecution of Tommy Robinson, I want to play you this short clip of Piers' twisted tirade and answer his allegations one by one. So take a listen.
Tommy Robinson is a convicted football hooligan who was convicted of beating up a police officer, leading a riot. He is somebody who's been guilty of mortgage fraud. He's been somebody who was guilty of forging a passport to get into America because he couldn't travel because of his criminal record. He's been found in contempt of court twice for nearly wrecking trials of the grooming gangs, where he turned up and was saying defamatory things at the courtroom, which nearly led to the whole case being collapsed. And now he's been found in contempt of court for repeating lies about this Syrian boy.
So the first thing Piers does right off the bat is he calls Tommy a football hooligan, referring to him by what he knows is considered a negative connotation in Britain. Football hooligans are basically young aficionados of what we call soccer in the U.S. They like to watch games together, celebrate a little too hard sometimes, rabble-rouse, and maybe drink a little too much, similar to what we might call a jock in our country. Mostly just a bunch of young guys with lots of testosterone letting off steam. But what he fails to mention is that Tommy's football hooligan days were 20 years ago. He's now matured into a prolific activist, journalist, and documentarian whose work has been viewed by hundreds of millions of people. But, he still needs people to see Tommy as that young EDL leader who caused such a fuss 20 years ago, so he doesn't tell you all that. But let's keep going. The next thing he says is that Tommy beat up a police officer. What he doesn't say is that when Tommy and his girlfriend were having an argument after leaving a bar, a man tried to physically intervene and an altercation occurred. But it wasn't until afterwards that the man informed Tommy that he was a police officer. He also doesn't mention that the police officer had been drinking and stuck his nose where it didn't belong, and that he absorbed the wrong end of an ass whooping, leaving him really basically with no recourse to gain his pride, but to charge Tommy. Piers leaves this a little bit out because he wants you all to believe that he assaulted a uniformed officer. Then, of course, he suggests Tommy was convicted of leading a riot. Now, let me be crystal clear here. There is nothing anywhere in Tommy Robinson's legal record whatsoever where he was convicted of leading a riot. So that was just an outright lie by Piers Morgan. But let's keep going here, because the next thing he brings up is the mortgage conviction, which is common knowledge, really. But rather than explain how the system threatened Tommy's family to get a plea out of him, I'll let Tommy explain it to you all as he did to Jordan Peterson.
What the country have seen, and I'll go through my experiences. Let's start on the mortgage frauds, Jordan. When I started my activism in 2009, between me and my wife, we had 7 properties, 2 businesses and 7 properties. All of my mortgages were 100% legit. And what they'd done is they went and got a 5-year investigation, and in their warrants, they went through my mum's accounts, my dad's accounts, every family member bank accounts. Now, what they got on my brother-in-law who was 21 or 22 at the time, he bought his first property. Now, when he bought his first property, the banks used to encourage self-certification mortgages. So it was encouraged by the banks. So basically, if you want to get a mortgage, as long as you put down 20% deposit, you could just self-certify how much you earn. You don't have to show your wage. You don't have to show your contract from your company. You self-certify. Now, as I said, I had 7 properties. I was buying repossessions and doing them up and keeping them. We were remortgaging the money. There's no question about any of my mortgages, So my brother-in-law, I lent him £20,000 as a young man to get his first property. He bought a property. He said it was £80,000. He bought it. He put £20,000 down, £60,000. He spent 9 months doing it up. He sold it 9 months later. So he buys the property. He said he earned £20,000 a year, but really he earned 12. So he buys it. He gets a mortgage. He sells it. The mortgage company are paid back. 3 or 4 years later, after this, they come in, they go through all the forms and they say, well, he lied on his mortgage form. Which the whole country lied on their self-certification mortgage forms. It was encouraged. They had no evidence against me. He lied on his form. What he lies on his form has nothing to do with me. So they get him, and then they say that when he sells the property, so he buys it for 80, he sells it for 120 after doing the property up after 9 months. He makes a profit. The mortgage company are paid back, so there's no one been defrauded. They then say that the profit then becomes the proceeds of crime because he lied on his mortgage form. What do? They nick him and they nick me. They then charge me on tax evasion. They go through my companies. They charge me on tax evasion. They say I owed the bank, I owed them £137,000 tax. They hold me on these conditions for 4 years, Jordan. They freeze my assets. They closed. I had 2 successful companies. Both of them were closed down. Yeah. So people understand the truth of what went on with the mortgage fraud. I had no mortgage fraud. They got me on tax. I got not guilty within 2 hours of the tax investigation. What they then done in court was they listed my wife to stand trial for tax. Now, no one knows what my wife looks like or my children, even though the Daily Mail tried to expose them last week. No one knows. So I can't walk down the street in the UK, yeah, without being prepared to fight. My wife can. So they then put her on trial. Then they pull me out of the court case. They sit me down and say, plead guilty to these charges. We drop your wife. We drop your other family members. So I took a plea deal.
You know, that sounds a lot like what they tried to do to Donald Trump using mortgage lawfare to keep him from winning the presidency, doesn't it, here in America? But back to Tommy, what does that really say about a man that will sacrifice his own freedom to save his family? But that's not the Tommy Piers wants you to see, so he doesn't break down the details for you once again. The next allegation is that Tommy was found guilty of contempt for nearly wrecking the trial of a grooming gang at the courtroom. First off, Tommy wasn't at a courtroom. He was outside on the street and the verdict
was already being deliberated.
So there was absolutely no way Tommy could have wrecked the trial, as Piers states. And the only question that Tommy asked as a journalist was, what do you think about the verdict? But I guess if you're an American, I should probably explain how they use this antiquated law to arrest Tommy. You see, rather than sequester a 12-man jury to keep them from being influenced by public opinion, courts in the UK will basically sequester the speech of the entire nation, issuing injunctions to prevent anyone from talking about cases in a way that might influence the jury. Now, I could talk about the other contempt of court charge for the case involving the Syrian refugee and the English schoolboy, but that's already been well litigated and explained in Tommy's documentary Silence, which has been viewed 150 million times on his X profile. Actually, a little more, I think, now. So you can see it there, or you can watch the pin tweet on my profile for a 5-minute synopsis of the case if you don't know about it. But lastly, I want to address this issue of the fraudulent passport. There's really no way of getting around that, and Tommy will tell you himself that he used someone else's passport to get into America. But why? The fact is, he wanted to attend a 9/11 counterterrorism event in New York, and with all the unjust convictions against him, he was unable to enter the country using his own passport. I mean, such a terrible villain, isn't he? I mean, he wasn't doing it for some sinister purpose, but to speak at an event that would bring awareness to the growing threat of jihad around the globe. But I think the broader question is, why can't people like Piers Morgan and Nigel Farage give credit to Tommy Robinson for all the fantastic work he's done and the justice that he's gotten for many victims of these grooming gangs in Britain, you know, without bringing up the bogus convictions from 15 or 20 years ago? You know, people grow and mature and should be able to be forgiven for their transgressions. And, you know, I can't think of anyone who's worked harder to do more good and change the public's perception of him than Tommy Robinson. I mean, think of all the people who have criminal records that have been so easily forgiven. Some maybe because of political persecution, others by their own doing. Nelson Mandela, Martha Stewart, Mark Wahlberg, President George W. Bush. And so many people throughout history have had previous criminal records and went on to do great things. Tommy Robinson is one of those. But the real reason you just can't stop disparaging Tommy Piers is, one, because of his politics, but most of all, because when he was a guest on your show, you were basically at the wrong end of an intellectual ass whooping. And you're such a petty little man that you still hold a grudge.